I was 28 and Jack was 33. We weren't especially close at the time. We weren't on bad terms. We were just two brothers who had gotten to the age where you mostly talked when there was something practical to talk about. The reason we ended up spending that weekend together was a farmhouse my grandmother had left behind. She'd lived there for most of her adult life. It was in Pennsylvania, a small town that I don't want to name because there are still relatives in the area, and I don't want anybody figuring out which property I'm talking about. It wasn't some huge old mansion. It was a 2-story farmhouse sitting on several acres with a large wooded area behind it. My grandmother had died a few months earlier, and my dad and his siblings had already dealt with most of the legal stuff. The house was going to be sold. Nobody in the family wanted to live there, and nobody had the money or interest to put into fixing it up. The bigger problem was that my grandmother never threw anything away. I'm not exaggerating. If something had been in that house for 30 years, it stayed there. There were drawers full of dead batteries, coffee cans full of screws, jars of nails, clothes nobody had worn since the 1980s, and random pieces of machinery that I couldn't even identify. My dad had already taken the things he actually wanted, mostly photographs and some furniture, but there was still a ridiculous amount left. Jack and I volunteered to spend a weekend cleaning it out enough for a realtor to come through. At the time, I was working in Pittsburgh. Jack had his own job and his own place, and outside of family events, we didn't really see each other much. He was pretty quiet. He could work all day without saying much, and then go home and watch television. I'm the opposite. I usually need something playing in the background. That became noticeable immediately because there wasn't much going on at the farmhouse, and cell service was terrible in some parts of the property. Jack drove his pickup, and I followed him in my car because I planned on leaving Sunday evening. I hadn't been to the property in like 15 years. The last time I'd been there, my grandmother was still healthy, and I was a teenager. The place looked smaller than I remembered. That's just what happens when you grow up. The yard I remembered as this huge open space wasn't nearly as big as it had seemed when I was a kid. There was one thing I noticed immediately: the gate. A heavy metal gate stood across the driveway about 6 or 7 feet high, attached to 2 stone posts. My grandmother had always kept it open when we visited, so I wasn't expecting it to be closed. Jack stopped his truck in front of it. I got out behind him. He was looking at a thick chain wrapped around the 2 sides. Did Dad say this was locked? No, neither of us had a key. The strange thing was that there wasn't a padlock on the outside. The chain was looped around the gate in a way that made it look like someone had secured it from the property side. Jack looked through the bars. Maybe the realtor did it. I told him I didn't think so. My dad had said nobody had been there since he and Uncle had finished cleaning the main bedroom. We ended up climbing over. Once we were inside, Jack walked around to the latch and looked at the chain. It was definitely ours. There wasn't any obvious damage to the gate. It looked like somebody had wrapped the chain around it and left without bothering to take it off. We unlocked the house and started working. Nothing felt strange. We opened windows, moved boxes, sorted through old clothes, and argued about what could be thrown away. At one point, Jack called me outside. He'd found a pile of bones in the grass. They were animal bones. I could see what looked like ribs, a jaw, and a few smaller pieces. There was another pile about 20 feet away with pieces of rotten meat mixed in with leaves and dirt. It smelled terrible. Jack poked one of the pieces with a shovel and immediately backed away. Yeah, we're not dealing with that. We left it alone. There were other remains around the property. Bones near the woods, bits of fur, feathers, and pieces of what looked like animal hide. Some of the bones were old and dry, but some of the meat looked much fresher. We figured somebody nearby hunted and dumped things on the property, or maybe coyotes were dragging animals around. Jack wasn't concerned. He was always the one who wanted an explanation for everything. Sunday morning, we found another pile behind the barn. By Sunday afternoon, we'd made enough progress that Jack decided to stay another night. I didn't want to. I had work Monday morning. He said he'd finish a few things and leave Monday afternoon. I eventually agreed to stay because I didn't want to drive home after dark. Jack had gone upstairs to take a shower. I was sitting at the kitchen table going through some old paperwork I'd found in a drawer. It was mostly utility bills and property tax notices. I remember reading one from the early 2000s when I heard something outside. It sounded like somebody calling out. I thought someone was on the road. I got up and went toward the back door. The sound seemed to be coming from behind the house. The words weren't clear. Help. I stopped. It sounded like a woman, just calling out. Help me. I opened the back door. Cold air came into the kitchen, and I could hear the wind moving through the trees. Please help me. I went upstairs and found Jack getting dressed. There's somebody outside. He looked at me. What? I can hear a woman asking for help. He came downstairs with me and stood in the kitchen. We listened. Nothing. I told him she'd just said it. He said, a fox. I told him it sounded like a woman. He reminded me that foxes can make sounds that sound disturbingly human. He wasn't wrong. I'd heard foxes before, but this didn't sound like an animal to me. It sounded like a person speaking. Jack opened the back door and listened. Nothing. See? I told him it would probably happen again. He said we'd deal with it if it did, and went back upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Help me. This time I was more irritated than scared because Jack had just dismissed it. I went back to the door. The voice seemed to be coming from the woods. I could see the tree line from the porch. There was nothing moving. I supposedly heard a woman somewhere in the woods, but I couldn't see anyone, and Jack hadn't heard anything. So I decided to walk out there. I just wanted to get close enough to see if there was actually somebody there. I told Jack I was going outside. He said, don't go far. I won't. I put on my jacket and walked across the yard. The voice came again when I was about halfway to the trees. Please. It no longer sounded like it was coming from somewhere near the house. It sounded like it was actually inside the woods. I thought somebody might be hurt. I kept expecting to find someone lying on the ground or sitting against a tree. I only meant to go a short distance. That's what I remember. A few feet in, look around, and come back. But after what felt like a minute, I turned around. I couldn't see the house, so I walked back in what I thought was the direction I'd come from. Help me. This time it sounded farther away. I kept going. After another minute or two, I stopped. I still couldn't see the house. That's when I realized I'd gone much farther into the woods than I'd intended. I pulled out my phone. No service. The voice stopped. I picked what I thought was the direction of the house and started walking. And I heard something somewhere to my left. I looked up, and there was something above me, almost like a person. But the proportions, the legs looked extremely long, the arms looked long, the body was so thin that I couldn't tell what I was looking at. I just stood there. It just seemed to shift its weight. I couldn't see its face. I couldn't even tell for sure that it had one. But whatever I was looking at seemed to be facing me. I backed away. Then I heard Jack yelling my name. He was somewhere behind me. That was what made everything feel real again. I turned and saw him between the trees. He was much closer to the tree line than I was. I started running toward him. When I reached him, I grabbed his arm. There's something in the tree. I pointed behind me. He looked. There was nothing there. He told me I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told him I didn't know what I'd seen. I just knew it had been shaped like a person and its arms and legs looked way too long. He asked if I was serious. I said yes. He looked back into the woods. Then he looked at me. We're going inside. I couldn't even explain how I'd gotten so far into the woods. That bothered me almost as much as what I'd seen. I knew I'd only intended to walk a short distance. Somehow I'd ended up far enough away that the farmhouse wasn't visible. Jack didn't believe I'd seen a person. He thought I'd seen a deer standing on a branch or some strange arrangement of trees. I told him a deer couldn't have arms that long. He didn't really have an answer. A few weeks later, my dad hired somebody to finish cleaning the property. I never went back there at night. I can explain a strange shape in the woods. A deer, a branch, shadows, bad visibility. I can explain the bones and rotten meat too. There were plenty of reasons for those things. But I still don't know why I heard a woman asking for help. And I don't know why following the voice took me so far into the woods that I couldn't see the house. Jack never heard the voice. He still thinks I probably heard an animal, and convinced myself it was a person. I had moved back home after my lease ended because I was trying to save some money. My dad said I could stay as long as I helped around the property, so that was what I did. I worked at an auto parts store during the day and took community college classes at night, although I wasn't exactly committed to the classes. I had changed my mind about what I wanted to do probably 5 times by then. The property was in Washington County, about 20 minutes from the nearest grocery store. My parents had around 30 acres, most of it wooded, with the house sitting in a cleared area near the front. There was an old barn farther back from the driveway. The barn had been there before the house. My grandfather had used it for equipment and animals when I was little, but by the time I was old enough to remember much about it, it was mostly storage. There was an old riding mower, tools, tires, broken farm equipment, boxes, and all the other things my dad refused to throw away because he was convinced he might need them someday. We weren't farmers. My dad was a supervisor at a company. The property had belonged to my grandparents before my parents bought it. My grandfather just liked having land. I had grown up there, so none of it felt particularly unusual to me. The woods behind the house were dense, but I knew the property well. I'd spent plenty of nights there by myself over the years. I had walked around the barn after dark before. I'd heard coyotes, raccoons, possums, and every other kind of animal you normally find around rural Pennsylvania. That summer was hot and humid, and the house didn't have central air. My dad hated running the window units because of the electric bill, so we'd argue about the thermostat like that was somehow going to change the temperature. We also had a dog named Buddy. He was an old black lab who had slowed down quite a bit by then. He mostly slept on the back porch during the day and followed my dad around whenever he was outside. The weekend this happened, my parents were going to Ohio for 3 nights to visit relatives. I wasn't interested in going. I had work Friday and Saturday. My dad went over the usual things before they left. Lock the back door, don't leave the garage open, make sure Buddy gets his medication. He also reminded me that the barn door stuck sometimes. The barn had 2 big doors at the front, and one of them didn't always close properly. There was a smaller side door that we normally used because it was easier. He left me a list of things to do while they were gone. I told him he'd basically left me a vacation itinerary. He laughed and said, "You'd be surprised what you forget when you're not here." They left Friday morning. I watched their SUV disappear down the driveway and went back inside. I went to work, came home around 6, and spent most of the evening playing games. A friend stopped by around 9. We sat on the porch drinking beer for about an hour before he left. The property was very quiet at night. I was used to it. I slept late, did some laundry, and went into town for groceries. At some point I looked toward the barn. The porch light illuminated the yard around the house, but the barn was far enough away that it was basically just a black shape against the trees. I remember thinking that if I ever had to go out there at night, I'd need a flashlight. I didn't think much more about it. My parents called around 9 that evening. My mom asked if Buddy had gotten his medicine. We talked for 5 minutes. They planned to drive home Monday morning. I watched some TV and eventually went upstairs. I woke up after 1 in the morning. I was still half asleep when I heard something that sounded like metal and a thump, something moving around inside the barn. The barn wasn't sealed very well, and we'd had plenty of animals get inside over the years. I got dressed, grabbed the big flashlight from the kitchen, and went downstairs. Buddy was lying near the back door. He was awake. He was looking toward the back door. I said his name. He looked at me, then looked toward the door again. I figured he'd heard whatever I had. I opened the door and stepped outside. I could still hear something coming from the direction of the barn. My dad had always told me not to go into the barn at night because of the nails, old machinery, and random pieces of metal lying around. That was the main reason I hesitated. Eventually, I decided that if it was an animal, I'd scare it out and come back inside. By the time I got close, the noise had stopped. I shined my flashlight toward the doors. One of the big doors was open. Like I said, it didn't always latch. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The flashlight wasn't very bright. and most of the barn was still swallowed by shadows. I could see the riding mower, shelves, old tires, boxes, and some equipment. Nothing looked disturbed. I walked farther inside and checked the old stalls toward the back. There was no animal. There was nobody hiding there. I figured whatever had made the noise had left before I got there. I pulled the door shut as best I could and went back to the house. Buddy was still lying in the same spot. I went upstairs and went back to sleep. The next morning, I got up around 8:30. I made coffee and took Buddy outside. I remembered the noise from the night before and decided to check the barn again, this time in daylight. Just walked in and started looking around. I saw 2 plastic bags hanging from a wooden beam near one of the old stalls. IV bags. I'd seen them in hospitals before. They were empty, but they still had tubing attached. One had a clear tube hanging down toward the dirt floor. I couldn't figure out why they were in our barn. My first thought was that someone had treated an injured animal in there. That was the only explanation that made any sense. We didn't have any animals that needed IV fluids. My parents hadn't kept livestock there in years. I called my dad. "Did somebody use the barn while you guys were gone?" He said no. I told him about the IV bags, told him I was standing right in front of them. He said, "Don't touch anything." That was the first time I heard my dad sound confused. I looked around the floor while we were still talking. That's when I saw a dark reddish stain in the dirt near one of the stalls. Several drops and a smeared area. I didn't even know if it was blood. It could have been rust or something old mixed with water. Then I saw the shoe. It was underneath an old wooden pallet. A woman's shoe. Small, black, and more like something you'd wear to work than anything you'd wear outside. One of the straps was broken. I picked it up without really thinking, then immediately put it back down. I called Dad again. "Dad, there's a shoe in here." I described it. He told me to leave the barn and lock it. I pulled the side door shut, put the padlock on it, and checked the larger doors. On the walk back to the house, I kept looking behind me. I still didn't know what had happened. The blood could have been old. The shoe could have been sitting there for years. But the IV bags didn't look old. That was the part I couldn't get past. Dad told me to stay inside until he could get home. He also asked me not to tell my mom yet, because he didn't want her worrying while they were a few hours away. I spent most of the afternoon looking through the kitchen window toward the barn. Nothing happened. No cars came down the driveway. Nobody appeared around the property. There were no more noises. By around 5, I'd convinced myself that whatever had happened was over. Dad called again. He and my mom were going to leave early the next morning. I told him I thought we should call the police. He said he agreed, but he wanted to see the barn himself first. I remember getting irritated with him. I thought he was taking it too casually. He said, "I'm not taking it casually. I'm trying to figure out what we're actually dealing with." That was fair. So I stayed home. That night I ate dinner in the living room instead of the kitchen because I didn't feel like sitting there alone. Around 10, I saw something outside. The barn light was on. I hadn't turned it on. There was a floodlight above the side entrance, and I could see it from the kitchen window. I stood there trying to remember if I'd somehow left it on earlier. I couldn't remember doing that. I'd locked the barn myself. Again, I called Dad. I told him about the light. He told me to stay inside. I was already inside. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, I heard voices. They seemed to be coming from beyond the barn, somewhere near the tree line. I couldn't make out the words. I thought somebody was talking on a phone. There was a road farther away. I moved closer to the kitchen window. Then I heard a woman's voice. I can't tell you what she said. I could just tell it was a woman. There was another voice farther away, deeper and harder to make out. The woman screamed. It was one sharp yell that stopped almost as soon as it started. I didn't sit there and think about what I should do. I grabbed my flashlight and went out the back door. Looking back, that was the stupidest thing I did. I'd already found the IV bags and the shoe. I'd locked the barn because I thought somebody might have been using it. And then I heard a scream and walked toward it anyway. But I wasn't thinking about any of that. I thought somebody might have been hurt. The barn was between the house and the woods. The floodlight was still on. When I got around far enough to see past the barn, I saw somebody standing among the trees. It was a man. I couldn't see his face. He was too far away and the barn light didn't reach the tree line very well. But I knew he was looking at me. I stopped. For some reason, what I remember most is how ordinary he looked. Just a man in dark clothes standing near the woods. I heard the woman again. It sounded like she was somewhere behind him. The man turned his head. That was what scared me, because it meant he had heard her too. He hadn't just been standing there randomly. He knew she was there. I turned around and ran. Once I was inside, I locked it and called Dad. He said, "Call the police." There were plenty of wooded areas around us. Somebody could have been moving through the property without us knowing. But the IV bags still didn't make sense. The police never told us much beyond the fact that there wasn't enough information to determine exactly what had happened. I was 29 when this happened, and I'm gonna call her, my wife, was 27. We'd been married a little over 2 years and were mostly trying to save enough money to get out of the apartment we'd been renting in town. I worked as a commercial electrician and my wife worked at office. We worked, came home, made dinner, watched TV. This was in southern Indiana. The farmhouse was few miles outside town, down a gravel road with only a few houses scattered around. We got the place through my wife's cousin. A friend of hers had parents who owned the farmhouse and weren't using it that summer. They lived in Indianapolis and were considering selling the property, but they didn't want it sitting completely empty. They offered it to us for 3 months for almost nothing, basically enough to cover the utilities and property expenses. My wife loved the idea. She'd grown up in a small town and liked having some land and privacy. I wasn't as excited about being that far from everything, but the rent was hard to argue with. The closest neighbor was a man named Dale. His house was almost a mile away down the gravel road. I was told he owned some of the land between us and the main road, although I never knew exactly where his property ended. We met him the first time we went out to see the farmhouse. He came over while we were standing on the porch and introduced himself. He was friendly. He asked where we were from, what we did, how long we planned to stay. He told us the well could lose pressure during really dry weather and that the gravel road got bad after heavy rain. He also warned me about a bend where water collected and told me not to take it too fast. There was nothing strange about him. It's easy to turn somebody into a creepy character after something happens. Dale wasn't creepy when we met him. My wife liked him right away. When we moved in around the middle of June, he stopped by. He told us there used to be cattle on the property and that the barn had actually been there longer than the house. My wife asked about fishing spots nearby, and Dale gave us the names of a couple small lakes. For the first month or so, we really liked the place. My work schedule was the only real downside. I was working on a commercial building project in Bloomington, and some days I didn't get home until 1 or 2 in the morning. My wife didn't like being alone that late. She always locked the doors before I left, and I'd usually call her when I was about 20 minutes away so she'd know I was coming. She'd tell me, "I'm not scared, I just don't like being alone." I used to tease her about that. Most of July went by without anything happening. We had a cookout with my brother and his girlfriend. My wife's parents came out one weekend and complained about the gravel road. Dale would stop by every week or two if he happened to see one of us outside. He also seemed to know every little detail about the property. He told me the field got soft after rain even when it looked dry. He warned me about nails and pieces of metal around the barn. Sometime in late July, he came by while I was fixing one of the porch steps. We talked for a few minutes, and then he asked if my wife was home. I told him she was inside. He nodded. "Tell her I said hello." That was it. Later that evening, my wife mentioned she'd seen Dale's truck turn around near the end of our driveway earlier that afternoon. I told her he'd stopped to talk to me. She just said, "Oh, okay." By August, work had gotten busy. The project was behind schedule, and we were regularly working 10 or 11-hour days. One Thursday, I left the job site shortly after midnight. It had been raining earlier, and the roads were still wet. I was exhausted. When I turned onto the gravel road toward the farmhouse, it was almost completely dark. There were no street lights, so once you left the main road, your headlights were basically the only light around. I slowed down at the curve Dale had warned me about because there was standing water across part of the road. I got home sometime around 2 in the morning. I pulled into the gravel area in front of the house and shut off the truck. That's when I saw somebody in the field. There were deer around the property, and it was difficult to judge distance at night. But after watching it for a few seconds, I realized it was moving like a person. It was coming from the direction of Dale's property. The person was walking toward our house. I still wasn't particularly alarmed. I thought it might be Dale. It made no sense for him to be walking across the field at 2 in the morning, but I couldn't think of anybody else who would be out there. The person was wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see a face. I got out and went inside. My wife was asleep upstairs, so I didn't turn on all the lights. I went into the kitchen and looked through the window over the sink. I could still see the person. He was no longer coming toward the front door. He crossed the field, went around the side of the house, and kept walking toward the barn. He disappeared behind the barn. I was too tired to keep worrying about it, so I locked the front door and went upstairs. My wife woke up when I got into bed. The next morning, I wasn't even sure I'd really seen somebody. It was dark. The person had been few dozen yards away. Around 10, Dale stopped by. My wife and I were sitting on the porch having coffee. He talked about the rain and asked if we'd had any trouble during the night. After he left, my wife asked why he'd asked about the night. I told her I'd seen someone walking across the field. She asked why I hadn't told her when I got upstairs. I told her I was tired and didn't think it was important. A few nights passed. Then, one night after 11, I was downstairs sorting through some work receipts while the television played in the background. I heard footsteps upstairs. I assumed it was my wife and called her name, and went toward the stairs. Nobody was there. I called again. My wife answered from the bedroom. "What?" I told her I'd heard somebody walking. She said she'd been lying down the whole time. I went upstairs and checked the bathroom and the other bedroom. Nothing. So, we went to bed. A few hours later, my wife got up to use the bathroom. I was half asleep when I heard the mattress move and her feet hit the floor. Then I heard her inhale sharply. A second later, she yelled my name. I was awake immediately. She came running back into the bedroom. She was shaking. There was a man downstairs. She said there was a man sitting in the chair near the hallway. She kept saying he was wearing black. I told her to stay in the bedroom while I checked. I didn't have a weapon. I grabbed my phone and went downstairs. From the top of the stairs, I could see the chair. It was empty. I went through the living room, dining room, kitchen, and bathroom. I checked the back door. I checked the other rooms upstairs. Nobody was there. Every door was locked. My wife stayed behind me the whole time. She was telling me she'd seen a man sitting in that chair. I believed that she'd seen something. I just couldn't understand what it could have been. I checked the chair itself. There was nothing on it. I moved it away from the wall. I looked behind it and underneath it. Nothing. My wife told me exactly where she'd been standing when she'd seen him. She'd just stepped out of our bedroom and hadn't turned on the hallway light because she didn't want to wake me. The chair was downstairs, like 20 feet from where she had been. She said the man had been sitting still, facing slightly toward her. She couldn't describe his face. We checked the entire house again. There was no sign of a break-in. We locked the bedroom door and waited for morning. The next day, my wife was still convinced she'd seen somebody. I wasn't sure what I believed. I checked every window and door around the house. One kitchen window didn't close properly unless you pushed it firmly, so I fixed it temporarily. I told my brother what happened. He suggested getting a couple cheap motion cameras. I ordered 2 that night. My wife wanted to leave. I understood. We packed some things and stayed with my brother for 2 nights while we figured out what to do. On the second evening, Dale called me. I didn't recognize his number at first. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes. He asked if we'd gone somewhere. I told him we'd stayed with my brother for a couple days. Why? Told him my wife had seen somebody in the house. What time? 2 or 3 in the morning. He eventually said it was nothing, and that old houses could make people think they were hearing or seeing things. That wasn't an unreasonable explanation. What bothered me was that he didn't sound surprised. He changed the subject and asked if we were still planning to stay until the end of summer. I said probably. He told me to call if we needed anything. I didn't tell my wife about that conversation. We went back to the farmhouse the next afternoon. The cameras arrived a few days later. I put one near the back door and another facing the field. Things settled down. Sometime in the middle of August, I came home around 1:30 in the morning. I was checking the clock because I'd been trying to get home before 2. As I pulled into the driveway, the motion light near the back of the house came on. What was strange was that I was still sitting in my truck. I watched the light for a few seconds. Then it went off. I assumed an animal had triggered it. I got out and walked toward the house. The field was dark. The next morning, she told me she'd heard something outside during the night. What? Someone walking near the back door. A few days later, I came home around 11. My wife was sitting on the porch. She told me she'd seen somebody near the barn earlier. What time? About 9. What were they doing? She said she couldn't tell. She'd been looking through the kitchen window and had noticed somebody standing near the barn. She watched the person for about 40 seconds. Then they walked behind the barn. She didn't go outside. I asked if she thought it was Dale. She said she didn't know. I checked the camera recordings that night. There was nothing. The camera facing the field had caught deer and one vehicle on the road. No person. One of the cameras was pointed slightly downward. I assumed the wind had moved it. I adjusted it. After that, there weren't any recordings that seemed unusual. We left the farmhouse at the end of September when the owners decided to put it on the market. I was relieved. We moved into an apartment closer to town, and a couple years later, we bought our own house. My wife never wanted to talk about the farmhouse again.